With the EFF's national shutdown set to take place next Monday, questions are being raised about the police's ability to prevent any violence and casualties. Today, National Police Commissioner Fannie Masemola is expected to conduct a state of readiness visit to Gauteng ahead of that protest. An independent panel previously found that police and governmental failings contributed to the July 2021 unrest, which claimed over 300 lives, and that affected many parts of Gauteng and KZN in 2021. So the question we're asking this morning, how do we prevent that kind of thing from happening in the country again? We're joined this morning by the Institute for Security Studies researcher Godfrey Mulaudzi. Joins us via our video link this morning. Godfrey, it's great to see you. Thanks very much for coming on. And that really is the big question, right? Given government's track record, when we look back to July 2021, how do we know that anything, or perhaps you can tell us, what has changed since then insofar as government conducting risk analysis and being more prepared?
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, and to the viewers. I think I must say I've got a little bit of cough, so in return I might as well I might cough, so I just need to put that up for the knowledge. Look, I think we need to firstly also look at the conditions that gave rise to the July 21 unrest, right? If we are to look at the state response into that kind of uprising or an uprising of a similar nature, if the state is can be able to respond to it adequately. You made mention of the report by the high panel report by Mufamali. There was also an expert panel report by Professor Fannie Afrika into the unrest, right? If you look, the Mufamali report that was in 2018, that is the high-level panel review report into the state security agency. Recommendations there. In fact, one of the mandate of that was to seek to achieve the professionalization of the state security agencies, right? And it also found that there has been a lot of politicization of the service, right? And high fractionalism into the service. Let me move forward and further recommended the overall restructuring of the service of the agency. Let's move forward to the Professor Fannie Afrika report that was looking into the unrest. That was in 2021. Similar findings were made by Professor Fannie Afrika because the inquiry was to look at the response of the state into the unrest, whether the state was prepared, it was timely, it was adequate. And the answer and conclusion of that report was that it was not. Now, if we are to find similar circumstances, similar unrest, would the state be able to respond to such? Has the capacity increased? Has the capacity improved in terms of those recommendations? Quite frankly, there has not really been there's been slow progress in terms of implementing those recommendations. But I mean, you could see the president has already made certain announcements to the National Security Council, has made certain announcements to the police architecture. There has clearly been a palpable discord between the then police commissioner and the police minister. And I think this was some of the reasons that the state was very slow in responding to the July unrest.
The minister in the presidency, Kumbutso Ntshavheni, saying that government will do everything in its power to prevent a repeat of July 2021. The defense minister also saying that, one of the previous mistakes that were made perhaps is ignoring social media, and that is a mistake that won't be repeated. Obviously, the minister in the presidency is not going to give us more detail on what she means when she says it won't be allowed to happen again, July 2021, because of security risks. But do statements like this give you a sense that things are under control?
Well, Michelle, I think it's quite early to tell that things are under control. But I think what we can say is that we can, read from certain announcements, certain moves by the president that there has been a willingness to address. But I think I must also indicate, Michelle, that look, for government alone to be able to cause kind of disaster, it is not impossible. I mean, it's not possible. Mm-hmm. We as citizens, I think we're going to need to have an appetite to desire a society where there's order, right? Where there is rules of law. And I think for that, government on its own, they will not be able to achieve that. So we're going to have to play our part as well, and political leaders on their part as well with their constituency. They would have to play their part to uphold the prescription of the law. Right. I think that is the bottom line.
Godfrey, what about the fact that this planned national shutdown actually doesn't have a starting point and an end point, right? It's not a normal service delivery protest in that way. In fact, the EFF leader, Julius Malema, in a media briefing earlier this week, saying people should gather wherever they are. Does this pose a particular kind of security threat?
Indeed it does, because if you look at the unrest, the July unrest, you're going to have to also look at the proximity of potential areas where people can loot, proximities to accessibility to the potential hotspots of looting areas. And if people are just going to gather everywhere, but also the proximities towards the police stations in particular areas where there's likely to be those kind of looting, where there are big factories, where there are big national roads. So, but I think that that they shouldn't really be so much threat as compared to what we saw in July of 2021, because what we're dealing with right now, we're dealing with an identifiable group of people who wants to protest, who of course wants to exercise their right? So that is not a threat to security of the state. As opposed to what you saw in July 2021, that was just a social media mobilizations of the unrest. Mm-hmm. So the leadership of the party that is organizing this, of course, they have responsibilities. They know the constitution. And I was listening to the leader previous few days, of course, making some pronouncement to the effect that there is no desire to cause violence. But I think that the state is ready, as we have seen the police, the leadership of the state, the security architects are giving a briefing. So there seems to be playing in terms of quelling any potential disorderly or destructions of property or looting. But I think at the end of the day, I think at this point, we as opposed to the July 2021, we're now dealing with an identifiable subject, which is the political party, and that is responsible in organizing this event.
Right. You raised the issue of taking into account people's right to protest in this way. That's going to need to be a key consideration of law enforcement insofar as how it manages what unfolds on Monday.
Definitely, Michelle. I think that is the bottom line. And I think we expect that those who are leaders in society, such as the party that's organizing this, would understand this better. That though you do have the constitutional right to protest, but of course it does not have to be violent, and of course you need to respect the rights of those that want to go by with their daily lives. Mm-hmm. Who don't want to take part in the protest. And I think once you breach that spills into the element of unlawfulness of your activity, of your protest. So I think that the EFF would not really be reckless in the wake of the election that is coming very soon. So I don't think that they would want to entirely be reckless to conduct themselves in a fashion that is violent, that destroy properties, because already as is now, there's a panic in the country from business people, those who are, who remember the tragedy of the 2021, the July 2021, the loss of lives, the loss of money to the economy, loss of jobs. So I think that people don't want to repeat that, because I think we now know that instability is not in our interests as a nation at all. Yeah,
it's certainly a theme that's been high up on our agenda as a country recently with the Nehau protests as well. My right to protest cannot infringe on your rights, which are enshrined in the Constitution. Godfrey Mulaudzi, let me thank you for your time this morning. He is a researcher with the Institute for Security Studies. Thanks very much indeed, Godfrey.